keep on working to reduce our deficit in a balanced way, an approach that's supported by the majority of the American people.
The president got $650 billion of higher taxes on the American people on January the 1st. How much more does he want?
And that's just one of the big stories we've been watching unfold lately. It's time to get caught up. And we've got just the group to do it this morning on For the Record. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. There's a new state budget proposal, a controversial school board election, UW chancellor candidates in town, and something called a sequester. My guest this morning, our Wisconsin State Journal editorial page editor Scott Milfred, former mayor and current author of the widely read blog Citizen Dave Cieslewicz, and the publisher and editor of the Capital City Hughes, Jonathan Gramling. Thank you all very much for joining me this morning.
Sure.
I quoted the Washington Post this week, an editorial that called the sequester a stupid argument over a stupid issue. And if any of you want to reframe that, feel free to do it. But I don't know how much people are paying attention to it. I get this sort of feeling that very little has happened noticeably in the last week, but that big things could happen. And I'm just wondering what you would say where people should look to feel the effects first if this doesn't get taken care of anytime soon.
Yeah, my biggest worry, I think, is the research dollars. We had Chancellor Ward in, I guess it's been a couple months now, but that's real to them. That's millions and millions of dollars potentially that wouldn't be coming in here. And it's not just the economic impact for Madison and the region, it's the research itself for our nation to stay ahead and out in front. So I think that's the first place I'm looking, but I honestly have to tell you, sort of alluding to your intro, that it's my job to pay attention to this kind of stuff, and I'm bored and I'm frustrating and I'm kind of tuning out myself.
Yeah. And in part, I wonder if that's driven by the sense that there's really doesn't seem to be any great interest in doing anything about this.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, the president got together with a bunch of GOP senators the other night. They're still at the restaurant arguing about the check. But there's a recent poll that showed only 28% of Americans were paying attention to the sequester at all. But I think more will as time goes by. Maybe the Obama administration overplayed its hand a little bit initially because people aren't seeing that big impact. But as Scott said, over time, it's going to affect things that people will notice. Research at the university, unemployment compensation, other things that affect people in their daily lives. So I would say, hold off, wait a minute. If this goes on, if the sequestration isn't reversed, I think people will start to see the effects.
Just in terms of the last couple of months, have you seen any indication that we're not in line for at least 2 more years of just simple gridlock? Nothing happens, both sides dug in, again, with no real interest in getting anything done here.
I don't know whether I'd be that pessimistic. I do think the Republicans are starting to see themselves as being portrayed, more or less successfully by Obama and others, as being the problem, as being the roadblock. I think Boehner gets that. It's a question of whether or not he can convince the Tea Partiers in his caucus that they really do have to come to some agreements.
I think Paul Ryan just said that maybe something can happen this summer, so he's already looking there. If I were to look for a bright spot, it might be that there's a lot of new people in there, and in our own congressional delegation, I think Mark Pocan, even though he's probably furthest to the left of anybody in the delegation, he's been trying hard to find, in his words, a Republican buddy to work with.
Right.
He went to dinner with Reed Ribble.
Right.
Ribble and he are getting involved in that no labels group that's trying to, you can label those guys, but that's trying to foster some communication across the aisle. Those guys aren't in charge, but they can put pressure on. So maybe some of the young blood can help pressure up.
You were in Washington in January, John, meeting with a lot of these folks.
Well, you got the 60 or 90 people in the swing seats in the House of Representatives. They're going to have to show something next year when they run for re-election. They can't run against Obama anymore because by that time he'll be a lame duck in 2 years. But they have to have been able to show that they did something outside of saying, well, we were for cuts, but it didn't happen, et cetera, et cetera. They got to achieve something, whether it's immigration, whether it's on the sequester or what have you. They have to proactively have something done by next year.
One of the obvious impacts of the last election was this sort of reawakening as to what America is, who we are, and it was as if a large number of people suddenly discovered that there were Spanish-speaking people in this country and African-American people in this country, and that it very much affected the Republican Party. What have you seen in terms of the after effects of that, John?
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful thing to finally that people are getting counted in polls and things like that who had never gotten counted before. When I was at the inauguration, and the seating section that I was in was very diverse. People who hadn't been involved weren't counted by the polls, especially the Republican polls that were kind of slanted traditionally. But then there was this whole group of people who weren't counted and all of a sudden have come out. I think it has gotten Latinos, African Americans more involved in the process. Probably trusting institutions a little bit more. And it's also then got the Republicans thinking about their long-term future. And I think also that the traditional white Democrats also had better start thinking about their future as well, in terms of, are they really going to reach out to a new leadership and really kind of reflect that national trend?
Is this a significant change, Dave?
Yeah, the Republican Party swallowed the Tea Party movement whole, and now it's given them indigestion because it's what's preventing them from making the necessary changes on immigration, on issues that reach out to these new demographic populations that they need if they're going to be successful in the future. Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona are all going to be in play for Democrats next time because of these demographic shifts. And the Republican establishment folks understand that the Tea Party is resisting the necessary changes.
Hence things like Florida Governor Scott just this past week being widely criticized for moving too far to the left in his state, or so it says.
Yeah, there's sort of a battle in the Republican Party now for, are they going to be more moderate and try to aim for more swing voters the next time, and even some Democrats, or are they not? And Chris Christie is sort of on the front lines of that, and it'll be interesting to see if the momentum can swing his way. He's still something of a pariah, yet has to be considered one of the top contenders for president.
Right.
And I think one other thing that kind of came out was the first real visibility of the Asian American vote kind of as a bloc. In previous elections, it had been kind of hidden because of the concentration in California and other areas that were pretty much Democratic states. But now in states like Virginia, even Wisconsin, Minnesota, and other, in quote, swing states, that there's a larger Asian American voting bloc now. And so now that's starting to also come into play in terms of national elections.
Yeah. So this whole discussion then of the Republican Party's relationship to the Tea Party and whose states are in play, then because of we've got Scott Walker and Paul Ryan here, keep those names really in the limelight, and I guess it's inevitable, but Governor Walker is being portrayed as perhaps one of the leading voices of the more conservative faction here.
Well, yeah, but it's interesting. You see him moving to the center, too. He's making very conciliatory statements about not wanting to see hot-button issues come to his desk, throwing a little bit more money towards the University of Wisconsin, doing a few other things. So I think what he's basically saying is, look, I sort of have that far right in my back pocket. Now I have the ability to move to the center and to appeal to some other folks that I need. The Democrats always underestimate Scott Walker. He is a smart politician. He knows what he's doing. And I think what he's doing makes a lot of sense.
I would say that he has to move to the center because he's up for re-election, that he survived the recall, in part because people didn't believe in recalls, not because necessarily that they believed in him. And the margin was close enough that he's really got to move closer to the center if he wants to get reelected, not to speak of have a voice in the national scene.
All right, we're going to take a little closer look at his budget when we come back right after this. My guest this morning, Scott Milfred, the editorial page editor of the Wisconsin State Journal. Former Mayor Dave Cieslewicz, who's writing and teaching and consulting, and you can find his blog, Citizen Dave, on the daily page. And John Gramling, who is the publisher and the editor of the Capital City Hughes. So we were talking about the state budget, and I just want to tick through that a little bit. Dave, you suggested that it was a more moderate position, but there are a couple of really hot button issues. The tax cut, which a lot of people seem to think may not be as effective as the governor would like it to be, and maybe and thus not a great use of that money.
Right.
And then the vouchers. And then, you know, either it's there and we don't see it, or we're not talking about it much. What's being done to spur job creation and some sort of economic development?
Well, I
here?
think the interesting thing is we're starting to see a more assertive Republican legislature, because they've essentially told the governor that they don't like his voucher proposal, and it may be modified, it may be kicked out of the budget altogether. We haven't seen that kind of break in the Republican ranks before. That's interesting. The tax cut doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because the governor, after working so hard to try to get rid of a structural deficit, created a new structural deficit, which is actually less than the tax cuts. In other words, if he didn't give the tax cuts, he wouldn't have the structural deficit at the end. So I'm kind of scratching my head over that one, and I know a number of Republican legislators feel the same way.
On the other hand, Scott, Chancellor Ward seemed quite pleased with how the UW was treated in that budget. Probably not so happy on the public school side of things.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if the Republicans, how far they backpedal on that. I wouldn't be surprised. It seems like the governor, when he put his budget together, he said, first of all, I want this tax cut, even if it's more symbolic than it is significant to people's wallets, and he was even willing to fudge on the structural deficit to get that. And I think he knew the legislature, when it came to education spending, would bring that up. But if you remember, when he was budgeting at Milwaukee County, he always wanted to come in kind of lowballing things. And I think he did that in this budget too, and he's willing to go up then, but he wants to have that high ground or low ground, whatever you want to call it. He wants to have that and go up. And then, as the former mayor alluded to, he had some things that he was very kind to that ease criticism. UW mental health was another one, to some degree workforce development. So yeah, and compared to the budget and the mini budget 2 years ago, just about anything's mild. So I think, you know, he has that as an advantage, sort of, where it's like, well, this is getting better. I think most of the public would probably say, with the election right around the corner.
I have to admit, I'm not accusing Governor Walker of this, because I'm not sure that it's true, but I am worried what I'm seeing nationally about increasing funding for mental health as a response to dealing with guns. It's an odd conversation going on that makes me uncomfortable.
It's all an odd conversation. I mean, I don't, frankly, I think the proposals from Senator Feinstein and from the Obama administration, while they appear to be strong in the context, the political context, aren't going to do much of anything. I think we have to move the debate and actually start talking about banning the manufacture, sale, and possession of automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons, all semi-automatic weapons, and handguns. Now, I know that sounds radical today, but in 1968, there was a presidential commission that actually recommended banning handguns in America. And if you look at where most of the damage occurs, it isn't in semi-automatics, it's handguns. And so I think we need to move the debate much further down the line, because what's being proposed now, frankly, isn't going to work.
Yeah, I don't think that's doable, though. You know, just with the politics that there are, and there's so many guns already out there.
300 million.
Yeah, and by the time the law kicked in, they'd crank out a whole bunch more. I just think that the Democrats need to pick their spots, and you know, making sure there's a background check on everybody. Boy, I sure hope this debate doesn't fall apart and we can't even get that.
Right.
You know, the whole mental health issue is more them having something that they can achieve, because they're not going to achieve the bans on weapons. They can say we did something, but I think it's a disservice to people with mental health issues in terms of, again, focusing, so does everyone a threat here and stuff like that, when, you know, the 99% of the people with mental health issues are people who walk amongst us, work with us, live with us, play with us, or whatever. So do you know what I'm trying to get at?
Absolutely.
Is it kind of reinforces stereotypes.
It adds to the stigma.
And it's just something so they can say that we achieved something in this area. But and we do need increases in mental health funding.
Exactly.
But that's regardless of what happened.
John, in a way, the voucher proposal in the governor's budget couldn't have come at a worse time for Madison. And the fact that he included Madison in it, because of the conversation that's going on about charter schools in Madison. And I feel like any hope we might have had for a reasoned conversation now about Madison Prep in particular is really going to be complicated by the voucher issue.
Yes. It is so murky and so complex. I mean, there are some things that I love in charter schools. There are things that I don't like. I think the vouchers are getting forced on us just like they were in Racine a couple of years ago. And just the way that it's being done, you know, he's kind of camouflaging the whole thing. So it's $129 million for public schools. Of course, that goes for property tax relief, and not a penny goes into the coffers for improving public education at all, while another $73 million is going toward creating the vouchers and the charter schools or whatever. I mean, it's good to have this discussion, and we need to have this discussion, but again, it's more complex than what can get discussed in a budget thing, where they're going to spend about 10 minutes talking about policy, and it really should be on its own so that you can really talk about the policy and the change in policy and its impact.
I'd like to get your thoughts on kind of what this means for Madison when we come back right after this. Sorry, I had to get the break in.
Not at all. I just get really fired up about something so many people don't understand.
This is the most important election for a school board in the last 40 years in Madison, Wisconsin. And I'm very concerned about this election, that it could keep us stuck where we are rather than grow and improve for the future.
Colleen Kerr talking about the recent school board election. I'm back with my guests, my pundit guests, Jonathan Gramling, Dave Cieslewicz, and Scott Milfred. This issue, the school board election, the voucher issue, the charter school issue, has resulted in as open a discussion, I think, as I've been aware of in a long time about Madison and what, for shorthand, people are calling the two Madisons. Madison, where people are feeling very well off and happy and successful, and people and the Madison where there's more poverty than I think a lot of people remember. I mean, you know this as well as anybody, Dave. I mean, what's your current perspective on this and on the conversation that's going on?
Well, the school district's right in the middle of that. You know, I used to go to Dan Narod's management team meetings, and he would come to mine. And whenever I went to the school district management team meetings, it was always the same underlying tension, which is the pressure to challenge kids who are achieving at very high levels, and then the pressure to deal with kids who have really remedial issues. And they were just being pulled in both directions, and you could just always feel them struggling with that. And I think that's what's playing out right now. And I think Colleen Kerr, you had that little snippet from him. I think he's becoming a really important voice on this issue. The whole Madison Prep thing, in my mind, yeah, I supported it, even though I had all kinds of concerns about it.
Right.
But the reason I supported it is if you go to a conference or you stand up in front of the school board and you say, boy, we got to do something about that achievement gap issue, not much is going to happen. You propose Madison Prep, and it got everybody's attention, made everybody talk about it. And so I'm really pleased that Colleen proposed that. Now the question is, how do we respond to it?
There's, as you know, Scott, there's a conversation going on the left, where the left is accusing the left of being insensitive to this issue, and of in fact kind of de facto encouraging it by not being more supportive of issues that have been traditionally described as conservative or Republican issues.
Yeah, I find it really frustrating. I mean, my two kids, 10 and 6, are in the Westermundo, and they're bilingual right now. You know, I was in the traditional schools.
Kinda cool.
Yeah, I was in traditional schools for years, and I was a good student, and I still can't speak it very well. Charter schools are
English or Spanish?
charter schools are public schools. You know, the Westermundo was started by two teachers who were in the union. It's a unionized school. It's a very different animal than the voucher school. And I think, unfortunately, you know, one of the candidates a couple candidates have come now out in Westermundo. There was Clean Care's proposal, which he wanted to cater to minorities, and it often will break down into this sort of privatization of education, and charters and vouchers are thrown into the same pot. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think you're right. There is a lot of that tension on the left now, and even in just one of the school board races now, you know, where you had one of the Latina woman lost, and people were talking about that. That followed another Latina woman who had lost a seat for the legislature. They may be gunning for Mr. Howard, who's black. So yeah, that's bubbling up, and I think it's unfortunate. And when I go to my kids' school, I can sometimes not even tell what the races of the kids are.
We have 1 minute left, John. Is this good for the city, or is this hurting the
Well,
city?
I mean, it's a great discussion, and it usually boils down to instrumentality or non-instrumentality and a level of responsibility. The school district needs to innovate, because what has happened just has not worked. And the more innovation that you allow while still having that accountability, I think, is very important, like New Westermundo. We've got Badger Rock going
right,
in,
exactly.
with James C. Wright Middle School, and all of those have reached students in different ways. And I think diversity is very important, both in terms of approaches, that one size does not fit all. The more that we innovate, I think the better off we are in the long term.
John, Dave, Scott, thanks very much. We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. My thanks to Mayor Dave, Scott Milfred, and Jonathan Gramling for being here today. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you next time on For the Record.